on it. So I've talked a little bit so far about how the activities of international companies and investors have an impact, have a bearing on these atrocities in the east of Congo. But you might say that I've been sketching out in very broad terms the, if you will, the sort of ethical argument for doing more. So it's probably a good moment to talk a little bit more about the other parties involved in this debate about conflict minerals, and to give you an indication of what their involvement might mean in terms of risks to companies which are sourcing conflict minerals and to their investors in terms of their reputation. So to run through a few things very quickly, first of all, we've got the UN Security Council. This is an international peace and security issue. It's repeatedly been recognized as such. This trade in conflict minerals is greasing the wheels of a conflict which has been going on for a very long time, and there's increasing acknowledgement that there's a need to take that financial component out of the equation to bring about a resolution. And because of that, the UN Security Council has gone from a situation where a year and a half ago they just had an arms embargo on the east of Congo, so you're not allowed to import weapons. But now, partly in part, we would like to think, thanks to our lobbying of Security Council members, they've expanded that sanctions regime. And what that means now is that companies which are engaged in the trafficking of conflict minerals in a way which benefits the armed groups could be put on the sanctions list. And that means having their assets frozen and a travel ban imposed on their individual staff members. Pretty serious stuff. And in fact, I know, because I've been in touch with members of the Security Council in the past 10 days, that right now they are debating, well, between now and mid-April, which companies they may put on the sanctions list. So watch this space. We've also got the OECD, which lays out guidelines for the conduct of multinational enterprises in third countries. These are not binding laws. However, they're quite an important set of regulations, what some people might call soft law, which set out standards which companies quite often feel the need to abide by or else face reputational damage. And what OECD are now doing is coming up with a specific set of standards for companies sourcing tantalum ore and other minerals from the eastern Congo. What due diligence measures they're going to need to take in order to be in compliance with OECD guidelines. And lastly, I'll mention quickly, and this has already been referred to in the introduction, to US Congress. There's actually 2 bills being considered by US Congress at the moment to deal with conflict minerals from the east of Congo. One in the Senate, one in the House of Representatives. The one which seems to have a bit more momentum at the moment is in the House of Representatives. And the essence of this bill is about compelling traders in tantalum ore and the ores cassiterite, tin ore, and wolframite, tungsten ore, to establish proper controls of their supply chains, and in fact to introduce a system of international audits undertaken by a designated list of companies appointed by the US government on the smelters of tantalum, amongst other materials, to see whether they can actually demonstrate that they've got proper control of their supply chains and are excluding these conflict materials. If passed, this bill would fundamentally change the way that the tantalum trade operates. Because, yeah, for sure, not that much tantalum may be being smelted in the US, but a heck of a lot of tantalum refined metal, which goes into products, ends up in North America. And what this bill would require, if put into law, would be for manufacturers to actually label their products saying, this product contains tantalum which is conflict-free, or this tantalum, the tantalum contained in this product comes from a smelter which is sourcing from a conflict area. So that's a potentially pretty powerful instrument. So, change driven by governments and intergovernmental bodies is coming to the tantalum sector, whether companies like it or not. And the pressure on private sector operators to demonstrate that they're part of the solution here, rather than part of the problem, is growing. And the spotlight is broadening out pretty quickly. I mean, we've been working on this for a long time. I would say as recently as a couple of years ago, when people were talking about this issue and scrutinizing companies, they were really just looking at a handful of export houses in the east of Congo. But then that changed, and all of a sudden it was smelters. Smelters already also being scrutinized. Now we've got the electronics industry drawn in. And we've now got people looking into the obvious next question of, well, who puts up all the money so that this can happen in the first place? So we've got all these initiatives coming the way of the tantalum sector. You might be wondering how companies are responding. I'm only going to talk about this very briefly, partly because there's not a great deal to say so far. But there are one or two nascent industry initiatives out there, notably one that's been pioneered by certain companies involved in the tin trade, which the main Tantalum Industry Association is now saying it's going to copy and replicate. And if this is an issue which crosses any of your desks in the near future, watch out, because this initiative, conjured up by something called the International Tin Research Institute, is not going to take you very far. It's full of holes, and it's being advocated most strongly by 3 companies, all of which are amongst the most notorious in terms of sourcing conflict minerals from the east of Congo. So companies which are looking at this, downstream companies, investors, and thinking, well, does this get us out of Dodge? Can we put our weight behind this and be in the clear? It's not going to wash. And companies need to think really hard about what endorsing an initiative like this might mean for their reputations. So, what exactly should industry investors be doing? I've talked quite a lot about this phrase due diligence, which is a much abused term in this day and age, of course. But I should say a little bit more about what it means in this context. First of all, what it's not about. It's not about investors, it's not about companies disengaging from the tantalum sector in Central Africa. Congo is a very poor country. It needs to be able to harness its natural resource wealth, including its tantalum ore deposits, in order to foster economic development and sustainable growth. A prerequisite for that, however, is ensuring that the extraction and trade of minerals like tantalum ore is under civilian control, under legitimate control. And as long as armed groups, including rogue military units, are able to profit illegally from this trade, they're going to maintain the stranglehold that they have on the tantalum ore sector at the moment. So what due diligence does mean is companies that source tantalum from Central Africa undertaking controls and checks on their supply chain that ensure that they're not buying tantalum that's passed through the hands of parties to the conflict which I've been describing. For investors, it means insisting on evidence from the companies in which they're considering putting their money that these checks have been carried out. So I'll talk just briefly a little bit about what those checks should include. When looking at companies which are actually handling tantalum ore, the raw material, what we're advocating is that those companies should be getting control of their supply chains through chain of custody systems based around some sort of reliable paper trail. That's pretty hard to come by in the east of Congo because the state apparatus is broken down. It doesn't function. So companies are going to have to take some measures themselves to fill those gaps. Even then, that's not likely to be enough. So companies that are handling these materials are actually going to have to go to the ground and check in person or using an externally sourced team where these materials really come from. Are they really from a legitimately run mine?
Mike, you've got 1 minute.
Okay, thank you. Are they passing through the hands of rebel groups or the army? Are there payoffs involved? Companies that are using refined tantalum in their products should be insisting that those checks have been done by the upstream players, the traders and smelters who handle the concentrate. They should be publishing who those smelters are, and they should be contractually requiring the smelters that supply them to disclose the mine of origin from which the tantalum ore comes, and making sure in those contracts that the due diligence measures which I've described very briefly are in place. So I better sum up quickly. If I was to give you one message to take away, it's this. Investors in tantalum need to start facing up to their responsibilities to ensure that they're not complicit in mass murder, rape, torture, and forced recruitment of child soldiers. They should seize an opportunity to take a lead in cleaning up a sector which is crucial to the global electronics industry, amongst others, and also to the long-term development of Eastern Congo. I'd like to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'll be around for a little while afterwards. I've got a few copies of some of our recent reports on Congo and the tantalum trade, which may be of interest, so please come and find me if you'd like to. Thanks.